what if the history of patriarchy wasn't, a story of men hoarding power, but rather this meticulously constructed, really demanding system of calculated male sacrifice?
Right.
Like, what if the structures we live under today have completely maintained that demand for male sacrifice, but just entirely deleted the reciprocal contract that, well, made it bearable in the first place?
It's a premise that completely inverts the standard narrative most of us have been taught since grade school.
Yeah.
It asks us to look at the foundational plumbing of our civilization from an entirely different and frankly deeply uncomfortable angle.
And that is exactly what we're going to do today. So, welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Whether you are someone who is intensely curious about modern cultural shifts, the psychology of the digital age, or you're just trying to understand the hidden foundations of our, crumbling institutions, this dive is custom tailored for you.
Yep.
Today, we are reviewing a frankly massive, incredibly intense, and ultra long text. It's a provocative 2026 ebook by Conrad Riker titled Social Media, Psychosis Control, Care, and Gynoterror.
Yeah, quite the title.
Right. Let's be upfront with you right out of the gate, though. This is an incisive, fascinating, and highly controversial book. It is heavily targeted toward a men's rights activist audience and red-pilled manosphere men.
It really is. It is a text that pulls absolutely no punches.
No, not at all.
Riker is essentially attempting to x-ray the hidden architecture of the modern world. He wants to trace the history of our institutions, specifically looking at how they function, before he claims they were comprehensively captured by this synthesis of feminist and Marxist ideologies.
Now, before we go a single step further, we really need to issue a very clear, very explicit impartiality clause.
Yes, very important.
This is vital for you, the listener, to understand. As your hosts, we are completely neutral here.
100%.
We are not endorsing, validating, or taking sides on any of the politically charged left-wing or right-wing viewpoints presented in this book.
Right. Our mission today is strictly to impartially report, unpack, and analyze Riker's argument.
Exactly. We are here to help you fully understand the mechanics and the architecture of this specific worldview so you can examine his claims for yourself.
Precisely. We are just mapping the territory he lays out. Nothing more, nothing less.
Yeah.
We are looking at the logic, the syllogisms, the hysterical claims, and, the data points he uses to build his case. Our job is to explain how his engine works, not to tell you whether you should drive the car.
Exactly. So if you want to buy the book we are reviewing today, check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books.
It's a very long read.
It is. But if you want to see the primary source and grapple with his arguments directly, that's where you will find it. Also, you can follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack for his ongoing essays.
Highly recommend checking that out if this topic interests you.
And of course, please make sure to like and subscribe to our show right now so we can keep bringing you these deep dives into complex materials.
So the roadmap for today's conversation is dense, so we really need to pace ourselves.
Yeah, we have a lot to get through.
We are going to start by exploring Riker's foundational claim about historical patriarchy and his theory of Marxist feminist institutional capture.
Right.
Then we're going to examine his concept of the fatherless state and the mechanics of what he calls gamma bias.
That part is wild.
It is. From there, we will unpack his theories on social media psychosis, which is a fascinating look at how the digital world has fundamentally altered human epistemology.
Oh, totally.
And finally, we'll outline his proposed male response, focusing on a strategy he calls the withdrawal of cooperation.
It's just a massive amount of ground to cover. Okay, let's unpack this. To understand Riker's diagnosis of modern institutions, we really cannot start in the 21st century.
Yeah, we have to go back.
Right. We have to start with his radical reinterpretation of historical patriarchy. Because if you don't grasp his view of history, the rest of his argument simply won't make sense to you.
It really won't.
It is the absolute bedrock upon which his entire worldview rests.
That's exactly right. The standard cultural narrative, the one most of us absorb through osmosis in universities, media, literature, is that history is essentially a long, unbroken record of systemic, sex-based patriarchal oppression.
Right. The story goes that men, as this unified class, hoarded power, wealth, and agency, and universally subjugated women.
Yeah, but Riker explicitly and aggressively rejects this framework.
He does.
He argues that historical oppression was overwhelmingly class-based, meaning it was about extreme wealth and aristocratic birth. not sex-based.
And he paints a very vivid, almost brutal picture of this to make his point.
It is.
He asks the reader to look at the reality of the average peasant man throughout history. Because, these men weren't sitting in castles hoarding privilege.
Or from it.
They were drafted into horrific meat grinder wars, sent to bleed to death in muddy trenches, or they were sent down into coal mines where they worked until their lungs literally collapsed.
Right. Their lives were defined by short durations, brutal physical labor, and a total lack of bodily autonomy. The state basically owned their bodies.
Which is a crucial distinction in his framework. Riker defines historical patriarchy not as a system of female subjugation, but as a male sacrifice system.
A male sacrifice system. Yeah, he argues it was a system bound by a strict reciprocal duty.
Let's talk about that duty.
So, the social contract, which was unwritten but universally understood, was this. Male physical risk, protection, and relentless provision were exchanged for female loyalty, domestic governance, and gratitude.
Okay, so a trade-off.
Yes. Men held formal public authority. They were the politicians and the generals. But Riker argues they held that authority precisely because they bore the ultimate physical and public risks.
Right.
If the city was attacked, the men died on the walls.
Meanwhile, he argues that women in those traditional societies weren't just passive victims. They held supreme cultural and moral authority within the domestic sphere.
Exactly.
They raised the next generation, governed the social fabric of the community, and controlled the household economy.
Right on the show at home.
Right. So, if Riker sees historical patriarchy as this mutual reciprocal contract, flawed, certainly, but balanced by a mutual obligation, how does he explain the transition to what he calls the modern gynocentric order?
Well, it's a big shift.
I'm trying to picture the mechanics of this shift. Is it almost like a business partnership where one partner retains their full salary, their corner office, and all their benefits, but just completely stops doing their half of the labor?
That is a highly accurate analogy for how Riker perceives the current state of affairs. Yes.
Okay.
Riker argues that modern institutions have managed to retain all the traditional male obligations. The demand for financial provision, the expectation of physical protection, the requirement of emotional stoicism in a crisis, while systematically deleting the corresponding female obligations, as well as the societal gratitude that once balanced the historical ledger. He calls the modern institutional framework a one-way extraction machine.
A one-way extraction machine. But a shift of that magnitude doesn't just happen by accident.
No, it doesn't.
It's not just a cultural drift. He traces this back to a very specific, deliberate intellectual movement, doesn't he?
He does. What's fascinating here is his deep dive into what he calls the Marxist feminist synthesis.
Right, the synthesis.
Riker points specifically to the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory and thinkers like Herbert Marcuse in the mid-20th century. To understand this, we have to look at the problem classical Marxists faced.
Okay.
Traditional Marxism posited a purely material economic struggle. You had the bourgeoisie, the wealthy factory owners who were the oppressors, and you had the proletariat, the poor factory workers who were the oppressed.
Classic dynamic.
Right. The theory predicted that the workers would inevitably violently revolt against the owners.
Right, but in the West, particularly in mid-century America and Europe, that revolution never happened.
It didn't.
The working class actually got a taste of the middle class. They got suburbs, washing machines, cars, and weekends off. The proletariat got comfortable.
Exactly. The economic revolution basically stalled out.
Yeah.
So Riker argues these critical theorists realized that if they wanted to dismantle the traditional Western hierarchy, they had to migrate the dialectic of oppression from economics to culture.
Wow.
They had to move the revolution from the factory floor to the family living room.
Wait, let's break that down mechanically, because it's one thing to say they moved it to culture, but how exactly do you migrate a revolution from a literal factory to a family unit?
You do it by reassigning the roles of the oppressor and the oppressed based on immutable biological traits rather than economic class.
Oh, I see.
The traditional nuclear family, objective truth, and historical institutions became the new targets. In this new framework, Riker argues, men were structurally recast as the bourgeoisie.
The oppressors.
Yes, simply because they historically held the public titles and built the infrastructure. Women were simultaneously recast as the proletariat, the perpetually oppressed class.
Even if the man was like a destitute coal miner and the woman was an aristocratic heiress.
According to Riker's analysis of their framework, yes.
That's crazy.
The biological category superseded the economic reality. And Riker points out a massive, deliberate accounting trick that made this ideological shift possible.
The accounting trick.
Yeah, he states that this new framework successfully convinced society of male oppression by strictly counting male authority while completely erasing male cost.
Okay, the accounting trick. Let's linger on this because it's a brilliant way to visualize his argument.
It really is.
When you say counting male authority but erasing male cost, you mean the framework looks at the fact that most CEOs and presidents are men, right? The assets in the male column.
Right. It points to the corner office and says, look at the male privilege.
Yeah.
But it completely ignores the massive liabilities they paid to get there, or the reality of the men at the bottom.
Right. It ignores the fact that men make up the vast majority of workplace fatalities, suicides, combat deaths, and the homeless population. The framework just erases the cost of male sacrifice.
And then it flips the trick for women. It only looks at the liabilities in the female column, the lack of historical voting rights, for instance, while completely ignoring the massive cultural and domestic authority women historically wielded as the center of the family and community.
Precisely.
Wow.
The result, according to Riker, is a ubiquitous ideological operating system in the modern West where any disparity between the sexes automatically equals oppression by men.
Right.
And where male labor is reframed not as a foundational sacrifice that ensured societal survival, but as inherently toxic exploitation.
But here is where causality really matters. If this intellectual movement successfully severs that historical reciprocal contract, I mean, a contract doesn't just sever itself in a vacuum and leave a void.
No, it leaves a huge gap. Right. If you tell an entire class of people, men, that they are stripped of their historical authority and respect, but they are still fully expected to maintain their traditional obligations to provide and protect, who is holding the gun?
That's the million-dollar question.
Because human beings don't just voluntarily agree to a one-way extraction without enforcement. Who enforces this new dynamic?
This brings us directly to Riker's view of the state.
Okay.
When the historical balance of the family was broken, the state didn't just passively watch. It stepped in to absorb the authority that was structurally taken from men.
So the state takes over.
Yes. Riker makes a very bold, very blunt claim here. He argues that the modern welfare state has literally become the replacement husband, and the family court system acts as its collection agency.
Man, those are incredibly heavy loaded terms. Let's look at the data he uses to back that up, because he doesn't just throw that out rhetorically. He dives into the mechanics of family law.
He does. He looks at what happens when the domestic contract dissolves. He cites that in family courts across the West, fathers almost universally retain full traditional financial obligations.
Right, they are legally mandated to pay child support, alimony, maintain health insurance.
Exactly. But they lose residential custody of their own children in approximately 80% of contested cases.
80%.
Yeah. The authority and the daily reality of fatherhood are stripped, but the financial utility is enforced under threat of imprisonment.
And he parallels this with the welfare system, right?
He does.
He points out that the state actively socializes male risk while privatizing female authority. He notes that single mother households receive public assistance like housing subsidies, food stamps, cash assistance at rates that absolutely dwarf single father households.
Even when you control for comparable economic situations.
Right.
For Riker, this isn't just an administrative quirk. He claims this is empirical proof that the state views women as reliable, permanent dependents, because their continued need justifies the endless expansion, funding, and power of the bureaucracy itself.
Oh, wow.
The state needs the single mother to justify its budget, and it needs the extracted wealth of the father to fund it.
So, what does this actually mean for the average guy waking up, going to work, paying his taxes, and navigating these legal systems?
It'll be bleak.
It almost feels like treating men as the municipal water line.
Yeah.
You know, no one writes poetry about the water line. You just expect the water to flow, and you only ever notice the pipe when it bursts, floods your basement, and inconveniences you.
That's a great way to put it.
Is that essentially what Riker is arguing here? That men have been reduced to invisible infrastructure?
That is an excellent way to conceptualize it. Male suffering, in Riker's analysis, is fundamentally and structurally illegible to the state.
Illegible? Like it doesn't even compute.
Exactly. It simply does not register on the dashboard. Why? Because a man quietly suffering, working himself to the bone, doesn't generate funding streams for a government agency.
Right. There is no multi-billion-dollar federal department of single fathers.
No. The struggling man is expected to just figure it out, man up, and keep producing. Male exhaustion, male labor, and male tax revenue are the silent, unacknowledged baseline requirements for the entire gynocentric system to function.
To make this systematic, Riker actually provides an equation, doesn't he? He tries to formalize the architecture of this system.
Yes, he calls it the gyno formula.
The gyno formula.
It is essentially his grand unified theory of modern institutional behavior.
Let's hear it.
The formula is female priority plus male disposability plus chivalric guilt plus gamma bias plus state enforcement equals the gynocentric order.
Okay, I want to break these variables down for the listener because I think they are crucial.
Sure.
Female priority is relatively straightforward. It's the societal instinct to center female safety and comfort above all else. Like women and children first on the lifeboats.
Exactly.
Male disposability is the historical and ongoing reality that men are the ones drafted for war and working the deadly, hazardous jobs. State enforcement, as we just discussed, is the family courts and the welfare bureaucracy extracting resources. But let me push back on one of these.
Go for it.
I'm looking at his breakdown here. And how exactly do you quantify something like chivalric guilt? It sounds a bit reductive. How does an emotion act as a structural variable?
It's a very perceptive pushback. But Riker argues that chivalric guilt isn't just a fleeting emotion. It is deeply embedded evolutionary programming.
Evolutionary, okay.
Yes, men are biologically and socially wired to protect women. Riker argues that the system actively weaponizes this instinct against men.
Weaponizes it how?
Because men feel an innate chivalric duty to provide and protect, they will actively vote for, fund, and support the very state apparatus and family court systems that ultimately disenfranchise them.
Wow.
The guilt acts as the grease in the gears. It ensures men don't revolt against the extraction.
That is dark, but I see how he connects the mechanics. But what about that fourth variable? Gamma bias.
Right, gamma bias.
What exactly is that? If the state handles the legal and financial extraction, how does the culture enforce it?
Gamma bias is the psychological and cultural enforcement mechanism of this entire order. The term was formalized by psychotherapist Tom Golden and psychologist Martin Seeger, and Riker relies on it heavily.
Okay.
At its core, gamma bias describes a profound moral double standard in how our society perceives gender.
A double standard.
In short, female suffering and female virtue are systematically foregrounded. They are put on the front page, celebrated, and addressed with massive resources.
Right.
Conversely, male suffering and male provision are systematically backgrounded, ignored, or actively mocked.
And the text provides some truly staggering, sobering data points on this to prove it isn't just a theory.
It does.
Riker notes that the CDC logged nearly 40,000 male suicides in a single year.
Yeah.
That's 4 times the female suicide rate. Let's sit with that number for a second. 40,000 dead men.
Tragic.
Yet, you look at modern universities, corporate HR departments, government initiatives, media campaigns, and all the multi-million-dollar budgets, all the cultural oxygen, are focused on closing the gender wage gap or promoting female leadership.
The disparity in media coverage is where Riker really sharpens his knife.
Oh, yeah.
He points at a specific media ledger. He analyzed major publications and notes that in 2021, the New York Times ran 147 feature pieces tagged mental health that centered on a female subject or female-coded distress.
147 pieces.
For men, just 23 pieces.
23.
And here is the kicker. Of those 23 pieces on male mental health, 12 of them were analyzing the pathology of mass shooters.
An indictment of the corpse, as Riker chillingly calls it.
Precisely. In Riker's view, the media ledger is perfectly clear. When a woman suffers, the culture dictates that it is a systemic failure of society that demands immediate structural overhaul and funding.
Right.
But when a man suffers, when he loses his job, his family, and commits suicide in a quiet apartment, it is treated as a localized glitch.
A personal failing.
Exactly. It is framed as his own personal failure. Or worse, he's blamed for his own death because he was too bound by toxic masculinity to ask for help.
Yeah.
His death is backgrounded. It is treated as irrelevant to the broader cultural narrative.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because Riker argues this isn't just about media bias.
No, it goes much deeper.
It's about how this specific type of bias has actively colonized the modern workplace and the very institutions we rely on to function. He introduces these concepts called Kahn's mind and the gossip court.
Yes, Kahn's mind, which is his shorthand for consensus mind.
Consensus mind.
Riker asserts that a historically feminine preference for consensus, group harmony, and subjective emotional safety has completely overtaken objective truth, rigorous debate, and due process in modern institutions.
Okay, so a shift in how we handle conflict.
Historically, he argues, male-dominated spaces resolve disputes through direct confrontation, objective evidentiary standards, and a clear hierarchical appeal. You argued the facts, someone won, you shook hands, and you moved on. Kahn's mind replaces that entire structure with secret reporting, coalition building behind the scenes, and relational aggression.
Relational aggression. He introduces a metric he created called the Relational Aggression Index, or RAI.
Right.
Let's talk about the hypothetical scenario he uses to illustrate this, because I think anyone who has worked in a modern corporate office will recognize the mechanics of this instantly, regardless of whether they agree with his underlying premise.
Oh, absolutely.
He describes a mid-level corporate engineer. This guy uses hard data, supply chain logic, and return on investment metrics to critique a female colleague's proposed project during a meeting. He's literally just looking at the math.
Right. It's a purely operational critique based on objective reality.
But within 48 hours, this engineer is called into HR. Not because his data was flawed, not because his math was wrong, but because his tone made his colleague feel unsafe and unheard.
Which is so common now.
Riker describes this process as a Kafkaesque trial. You are suddenly accused of a vibe crime.
A vibe crime, exactly.
And the most insidious part, merely asking for evidence of your crime, asking HR what specific rule you broke, or what word you said that was offensive, is treated as further compounding proof that you are combative, aggressive, and guilty.
Right.
The demand for evidence is itself a crime against the consensus.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Riker lays a massive amount of the blame for this institutional shift on what he terms the therapy industrial complex.
Oh, the therapy speak.
He argues that therapy speak has completely metastasized out of the clinical setting and into the boardroom and the living room.
Yeah.
Therapy language started as a tool for clinical self-awareness, but Riker claims it has been weaponized into a vernacular for policing the behavior of others.
Right, using clinical terms casually.
Terms like gaslighting, narcissist, emotional safety, and setting boundaries are now routinely used to pathologize normal, rational male behavior.
The boundaries thing is fascinating. He points out that a boundary used to mean controlling your own behavior. Like, I have a boundary, I will not stay in a room where someone is yelling at me.
Exactly. That's a healthy boundary.
Now, the therapeutic language has morphed boundaries into issuing unilateral decrees about what other people are allowed to say or do around you.
It's control.
And if they disagree with your subjective interpretation of the world, they aren't just disagreeing with you, they are violating your boundaries and committing an act of emotional violence.
Exactly. Riker argues this therapy culture essentially sanctifies female fragility.
Sanctifies it.
It treats subjective emotional distress as if it were objective, actionable, physical harm. If you feel slighted, then violence has occurred.
Right.
Meanwhile, it actively pathologizes male stoicism, directness, and logic as toxic or repressed.
So you can't win.
Right. It creates an institutional environment where whoever can claim the most profound emotional distress automatically wins the power struggle. Victimhood becomes the ultimate currency of authority.
Which is a perfect logical transition to the next massive pillar of his book.
It is.
Because if institutional power is maintained by this Kahn's mind and HR gossip, what happens when you take that exact psychological mechanism and give it a global digital infrastructure?
It amplifies it 1,000,000 times.
The gossip court isn't just in HR departments anymore. It is the foundational architecture of the internet. We carry the gossip court in our pockets 24/7.
We really do.
Let's talk about hyperreality and social media psychosis.
This is perhaps the most philosophical and deeply researched section of the text. Riker leans heavily here on the 20th century French philosopher Jean Baudrillard and his concept of hyperreality. Okay, for the listener, hyperreality is the idea that in a highly mediated society, the symbol, the simulation, has actually replaced the real thing. The map has replaced the territory.
That's a great way to think about it.
Riker argues that social media platforms are structurally and algorithmically designed to reward performative emotional extremes and perpetual grievance.
Right.
The digital mirror doesn't reflect who you are. It actively replaces you with a curated avatar of your own trauma.
He paints this chilling, incredibly precise picture of what he calls the algorithmic confessional.
Yes.
He describes a 19-year-old woman who posts a 3-minute video of herself sobbing uncontrollably in her car, describing a deep childhood trauma or a recent breakup.
We've all seen those videos.
Historically, for all of human existence, this level of intense, raw vulnerability is a deeply private moment. It is meant for a therapist, a priest, or a best friend in a closed room.
Exactly.
But on social media, that breakdown gets 2 million views. Her comment section is instantly flooded with strangers providing intense digital validation. You are so brave, your trauma is valid.
And then the commodification kicks in.
Right.
By Tuesday, she has launched a merchandise line featuring slogans from her breakdown. Healing My Inner Child hoodies.
It's a business model.
By Friday, she has a Patreon and is hosting a paid workshop on surviving toxic relationships. The trauma is completely commodified and incentivized.
Unbelievable.
Riker argues that the algorithm essentially acts as a secular high priest, distributing the sacraments of attention, dopamine, and status.
But there's a danger there,
A
right?
huge one.
Yeah.
Here is the critical danger. The algorithm does not reward actual healing.
No.
Healing is slow, it is quiet, it is nuanced, and it is entirely unphotogenic. The algorithm rewards the perpetual, escalating performance of the wound. If she heals, she loses her audience.
And this creates what Riker diagnoses as a borderline epistemology. Let's define that.
Epistemology, right.
Epistemology is the philosophical study of how we know what is true. What is the basis of truth?
Yeah.
In the social media feed, Riker argues, truth is entirely dictated by mood. If I feel unsafe, then danger is objectively present.
It's all feelings-based.
A lack of digital validation, just being ignored or getting low engagement on a post, is viscerally interpreted by the nervous system as an act of interpersonal violence and social exile.
This raises an important question, and Riker backs his claims with significant empirical data.
Let's hear the data.
He heavily cites the 2017 Royal Society for Public Health report in the UK, which definitively linked visual platforms, specifically Instagram, to massive spikes in anxiety, severe depression, and body dysmorphia among young women.
Wow.
He couples this with extensive Pew research showing that 95% of teen girls use these platforms as their primary social venue, which directly correlates with an absolute explosion in relational conflict and self-harm.
Okay, I have to pause here and push back on behalf of the listener because this is where Riker's framing gets incredibly specific and some might say controversial.
Sure,
Aren't men absolutely addicted to these algorithms too?
they are.
Walk into any room and the men are endlessly scrolling through Twitter, watching YouTube shorts, or looking at sports metrics. We are all hooked.
Right.
Why does Riker frame this digital psychosis as a specifically feminine vulnerability? Why is it gynoterror?
That is a crucial distinction to unpack in his theory. Riker acknowledges that men are addicted to screens, but he argues the nature of the addiction is different due to evolutionary psychology.
Okay, how so?
Riker argues that the female nervous system was historically and evolutionarily calibrated to prioritize group harmony, peer approval, and relational safety above all else.
The consensus again.
Exactly. In a small ancestral tribe, social exile meant literal death for a woman, so they are hyper-attuned to the social consensus. The social media algorithm, he claims, perfectly weaponizes this exact evolutionary trait.
So it hacks the hardware.
Exactly. It creates a synthetic global status market where the metrics, the likes, the shares, the follower counts become a biological substitute for oxygen. He calls it metric addiction.
Metric addiction. Right.
Men use social media to argue about facts or look at things or distract themselves, but Riker claims women are uniquely evolutionarily vulnerable to mistaking the digital consensus for actual reality because of how their relational hardware is wired to constantly scan the horizon for social approval.
And he brings in the work of Jonathan Haidt, the social psychologist, to really cement the mechanics of this.
Yeah, Haidt's research is key here.
Haidt's research demonstrated that human beings actually process moral judgments emotionally first. The rational, logical justification for why we believe something comes milliseconds later as a post hoc defense of the emotion.
Exactly. We feel first, think second.
The social media algorithm knows this implicitly. It selects for limbic intensity. If you post a calm, rational, heavily cited paragraph about tax policy, it gets zero traction.
Nobody cares.
But a tearful, furious, hyper-emotional 15-second performance of outrage goes viral instantly.
Right. The platform fundamentally does not care if you are factually correct. It only cares if your content triggers an emotional response that keeps people scrolling and looking at ads.
It's just a machine.
Riker argues this creates a moral weather online that is based entirely on emotional contagion and consensus. It completely inverts what classical philosophy calls the transcendentals: truth, beauty, and goodness.
Wow.
In the hyperreal space of social media, the image replaces the substance. The simulation becomes more powerful than reality.
Okay, so let's take a breath. We've mapped a fairly bleak, intensely analytical diagnosis of the modern condition.
Very bleak.
According to Riker, we are living in a vast, interconnected system of technological extraction, historical revisionism, institutional hostility, and algorithmic psychosis.
It's a lot.
Confronted with all of this, what is the practical takeaway? What does Riker prescribe for his audience of men who feel entirely alienated by this system? What is the male response?
The first, most critical, and arguably the most difficult step in his prescription is the absolute immediate end of JD.
JD?
JADE. It stands for Justify, Argue, Defend, Explain.
Yes, he has this powerful line where he says he stood in way too many HR offices and family courtrooms watching good men exhaust themselves trying to logically explain themselves into the void.
Exactly. Riker argues that seeking permission to exist or trying to logically prove your innocence to a system that is fundamentally designed to extract from you and presume your guilt from the outset is a profound waste of male energy.
It's a trap.
It is a losing battle. The gossip court, the HR tribunal, the social media mob, they do not want your logic. They do not care about your data points.
Yeah.
They want your submission. They want you to validate their power by engaging with their premise. So the first step of the male response is to simply stop explaining, stop arguing with a hyper-reality, close your mouth.
He calls this broader philosophy strategic withdrawal.
Yes.
And this is the absolute core of what he identifies as the manosphere's parallel intelligentsia. We need to be clear here. We aren't talking about violent protests, political lobbying, or burning buildings.
Not at all.
We are talking about a quiet, invisible, systematic withdrawal of male cooperation and competence.
He advises his male readers to ruthlessly and unsentimentally audit their lives and their institutions for hidden, sex-disaggregated costs.
To really audit everything.
Yes. Look at where you work, look at your romantic relationships, look at your government, look at your church. Ask 3 questions. Who pays the cost? Who reaps the benefit? Whose pain is funded?
Those are sharp questions.
If an institution extracts duty, labor, and compliance from you, while actively denying your authority and structurally criminalizing your inherent masculinity, Riker says you have a moral obligation to yourself to completely withdraw your voluntary contribution.
So you just stop.
You do the bare minimum to survive, but you withdraw your mentorship, your extra hours, your emotional labor, and your loyalty.
I have to ask, though, because I know a lot of listeners are wondering this right now. Is this just a retreat into bitterness?
It's a fair question.
Is this just a sophisticated intellectual justification for men taking their ball and going home because they don't rule the roost anymore?
Huh.
Is it actual architecture, or is it a tantrum? Because he insists over and over that this isn't a tantrum.
He is incredibly adamant that it's not a tantrum. It is economic.
Economics.
He frames strategic withdrawal as a highly rational market response to severe supply suppression.
Okay, unpack that.
If the legal and cultural environment treats male participation in marriage, corporate mentorship, or community leadership as an absolute liability, where you can lose your children, your reputation, or your livelihood based on a subjective accusation, the only rational, self-preserving response is to disengage.
Right. It's risk management.
Exactly. It is risk management.
No.
But Riker argues it doesn't stop at merely walking away. The ultimate goal is utilizing that freed up energy to build parallel structures entirely outside the gynocentric stack.
Parallel structures, like what?
He's talking about independent media networks, private financial cooperatives, homeschooling coalitions, and male-only retreats.
To help men execute this withdrawal, he gives the reader an analytical tool called the Civil Reclamation Index.
Yes, the index.
It's essentially a metric to measure the viability of any institution based on the ratio of truth-based claims to mood-based claims.
Right.
For example, if a university Title IX office operates on the standard of the complainant felt unsafe, rather than requiring verifiable incidents and physical evidence, it scores low on the index.
Very low.
It is hostile to due process and objective reality. You walk away. Do not donate to them. Do not attend. If an institution demands physical evidence, cross-examination, and logical rigor, it scores high. You invest there.
This analytical approach ties into his ultimate philosophical solution, the return to logos and craft.
Logos and craft.
To survive the digital psychosis, Riker relies heavily on classical logic and what is known as the medieval trivium, the foundational study of grammar, logic, and rhetoric.
Going back to the basics.
He demands that men rebuild their interior witness. In the modern world, your conscience has been outsourced to the algorithm.
That's a scary thought.
Riker says you must take it back. Your interior witness must judge right and wrong based on objective, transcendent truth, not on how many likes a post gets or what the prevailing HR consensus happens to be that week.
He recommends an absolutely hardcore 30-day metric fast to begin this process.
A full detox.
Delete the apps off your phone. Unplug the router. Sit in absolute terrifying solitude. Recalibrate your dopamine receptors in your brain to reality. Let the boredom wash over you until you can actually hear your own thoughts again.
And crucially, recalibrate your physical body to the material world.
Yes.
He urges men to return to physical labor, master real tools, work on a car engine, build a shed, plant a garden, anchor yourself in the undeniable material reality of soil, sweat, and biological truth.
Real things.
Riker makes a profound philosophical point here. A man building a wooden table with calloused hands has more ontological reality, more actual substance, than a million digital influencers posing in their curated, hyper-real feeds.
Because reality doesn't negotiate.
No, it doesn't.
The laws of physics, the changing of the seasons, the necessity of agriculture, they do not care about your pronouns, they do not care about your unresolved childhood trauma, and they do not care about your boundaries.
Right.
Riker genuinely believes that the modern gynocentric order is entirely a luxury belief system. It is an illusion maintained by immense wealth.
And cheap energy.
Exactly. It literally cannot survive for a single week without the invisible, unthanked audience of men waking up at 4 a.m. to provide the foundational labor, the tax revenue, the electrical grids, and the physical infrastructure that keeps the lights on and the servers humming.
And that, right there, is the crux of his leverage.
The leverage.
The entire system is designed to extract from men. Therefore, the entire system is utterly dependent on men.
Right.
If the men simply stopped rehearsing their defense to the gossip court, stop providing unearned emotional and physical labor, and simply walk out of the theater to go build their own structures in the real world, Riker predicts that the hyperreal simulation will inevitably collapse under the weight of its own physical impossibility.
Because it's not real?
The simulation requires real electricity, and someone has to mine the coal.
Man, it is an incredibly intense, almost dizzying journey through Riker's worldview.
It really is.
We have covered the sweeping rewriting of historical patriarchy and the concept of male sacrifice. We've looked at the brutal mechanics of the fatherless state, the psychology of gamma bias and cons mine in the workplace.
We cover a lot of ground.
We've stared into the terrifying hyperreality of algorithmic social media psychosis. And finally, we unpacked the stoic, quiet, strategic withdrawal of the male response.
It is, without a doubt, a comprehensive architectural audit of modern civilization from a very specific, highly structural, and deeply critical perspective.
Yeah.
And look, whether you, the listener, agree with Riker's foundational premises, or whether you find his views completely alarming and offensive, his diagnosis of how algorithms and institutional incentives manipulate human behavior, reward performative vulnerability, and ruthlessly silence logical dissent is undeniably a powerful force shaping modern discourse.
It's everywhere.
The mechanisms he describes, the algorithm acting as a secular priest, the gossip court replacing constitutional due process, these are not just theories. They are observable daily phenomena in our culture.
Exactly. Even if you reject his conclusions about gender, you can clearly see the gears of the machine turning once he points them out to you.
You really can't unsee it.
You can't unsee the hyperreality once the curtain is pulled back. So, as we wrap up this massive deep dive, we want to leave you with a final, provocative thought to ponder on your own.
Something to chew on.
It builds on everything we've discussed today, but takes it one step further. Riker claims that reality eventually sends its invoice.
Right.
So what happens to a highly digitized, feelings-based, hyper-bureaucratic civilization when the underlying physical infrastructure and the men who traditionally maintain it in the background simply decide to stop clapping, put down their heavy tools, and walk out of the theater?
What happens then?
How long can a society actually run purely on metrics and mood before the physical world forcefully and perhaps violently reasserts itself?
A civilization suspended entirely in a digital, emotional hyper-reality eventually has to pay the electric bill.
Yeah.
It's a question of when, not if. The physics always win.
It's something to seriously mull over the next time you open an app or sit in a corporate meeting. Thank you so much for joining us on this intense deep dive today.
Thanks for listening.
Once again, if you are intrigued by this framework, if you want to read the primary source material, examine the data, and explore the syllogisms for yourself, you need to check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to purchase Social Media Psychosis Control, Care and Gynoterror by Conrad Riker.
And be sure to follow the author at Conrad Riker at Substack for his ongoing essays, institutional audits, and updates on his cultural analysis.
Finally, please make sure to like and subscribe to the show right now. We absolutely love bringing you these deep dives into fascinating, complex, and controversial source material. Your support helps us keep the lights on and the conversation going. Until next time, keep questioning the architecture around you.